Hi everyone, Dr. Hall and Oliver. I don't know if you can see him. Oh, there he goes. Okay. And Oliver. Limbic system part two. So other structures of the brain that are involved in emotion, a sampling. The four we're going to talk about are the prefrontal cortex, the pituitary gland, the insula, and the anterior cingulate cortex, sometimes also called the cingulate gyrus. So you will see that term used as well. This is not the best diagram, but it was the best I could find. Let's talk about the prefrontal cortex first. You know this part. So in the frontal lobe, this is the most frontal part of the frontal lobe, called the prefrontal cortex, and it is involved in judgment and decision making. It's involved in executive function, which is our ability to figure out how to actually accomplish a task. If I want to get from here to there, what are all the things I need to do along the way and in what sequence? So that's our executive function, our ability to plan things out and get them done. It's also important for impulse control. So remember the story of Phineas Gage, and he got the thing through his head, and then his personality and his behavior was different. He was a lot wilder, for example. So how does the prefrontal cortex play a role in emotion? Well, it's going to use memories and help analyze the situation and predict what it means for us. What's interesting too is, that when we learned about patient HM and people who had lost their hippocampus and lost their ability to form new long-term memories, and they often said otherwise they were pretty good. But there was one researcher who said, actually, if we asked them to imagine scenarios and imagine and create like a fictional story, they were very limited in what they were able to come up with, which I thought was fascinating. So again, using the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex together, we look at our past memories, our past experiences to make sense of the world around us. So when you saw that TED Talk about scripts and our understanding of what different situations are and how we have to be careful of what scripts we activate. So that's this, right? So this is using your brain to figure out, okay, this is what's happening right now. Is this good for me? Is this bad for me? How is it likely going to go? How is it going to impact me or the people around me? So prefrontal cortex is going to be important for emotions. They've also done experiments in animals, removing the cortex and seeing what happens. So they surgically removed it from cats and they became hyper aggressive. So you just tried to pat them and they would hiss at you, they'd swipe at you, they'd bite at you, right? You just touch their tail, they freak out. So maybe kind of like some of those cats that you've seen who've been rescued from the street that are just really traumatized. They call this sham rage because there's nothing to actually be furious about, and yet they are, overreacting. And so obviously, if you remove the cortex, and we think it's the prefrontal cortex particularly that is suppressing aggression, these animals behave very aggressively. The effect went away if they also happen to remove the hypothalamus, which suggests that perhaps some of these impulses to act aggressively are coming from the hypothalamus. And in fact, when they had cats who still had their cerebral cortex, if they stimulated the hypothalamus, that made them aggressive. So yes, the hypothalamus seems to stimulate aggression and is normally suppressed by the prefrontal cortex. And they also found that if you remove the amygdala, that makes them less aggressive. So it seems that both the hypothalamus and the amygdala promote aggression, right? And we certainly saw with Kluver-Bucy that the monkeys were just total chill when you remove their amygdala. But the cortex, probably the prefrontal cortex, normally suppresses aggression and kind of keeps things under control. Next, we're going to talk about the pituitary gland. I think of the pituitary gland as like the right-hand man for the hypothalamus. They work together almost always. So it kind of works for and with the hypothalamus. So here is this diagram of a brain. Here is the thalamus. Here is the hypothalamus, and then we've zoomed in on that place right below it where you're going to find the pituitary gland. And it kind of dangles down from the brain like, well, it looks like a scrotum, let's just be honest. But so the pituitary gland does hang down from the brain. There's a special little spot in the skull. We should look at it in lab, remind me, where it sits. So the hypothalamus sends all kinds of signals down to the pituitary gland, telling it what to do, and the pituitary gland releases hormones. Sometimes they are hormones that the pituitary gland makes and releases. Sometimes they're hormones that are actually coming from the hypothalamus and made by the hypothalamus. One of those hormones, the one I want to talk about in this part of the lecture, is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is also sometimes called the love hormone. So it gets released by the pituitary gland. It's a hormone. It travels through the bloodstream in response to a variety of different types of stimuli. Breastfeeding will do it. Orgasm does it, snuggling does it, looking at adorable pictures of puppies will do it sometimes. And what we find is that oxytocin really stimulates and promotes social bonding within the group and then with the people that you're with. So that's the love hormone. Pretty smart of Mother Nature to make it so that when you're breastfeeding your baby and they're waking you up every 2 hours all night long, that you get a nice little dose of the love hormone so that you're, to kind of compensate for the fact that they're waking you up yet again. What's interesting about this is that although it promotes social bonding and cohesion and a sense of closeness and intimacy with the person that you're with, they've also found that it can increase aggression towards members of the out group. So if it's not part of your family, not part of your friend group, not part of your tribe, not part of your community, oxytocin can actually make you more hostile to people who are outsiders or others, which I think is interesting. And evolutionarily was probably beneficial. In our modern society, probably not. The next structure I want to talk about is the insula. So the word insula comes from the word that means island because it's kind of on its own. It's in this funny little place. So if you pry open that this little lateral fissure here between the frontal and parietal lobes and the temporal lobe. So they've taken these retractors and they're opening it up. There's this little lobe in there, kind of. It's called the insula. So this diagram down here this would be anterior. This is a transverse. I can't make an A. This is a transverse section like this through the brain. So that's the front. This is the back. So again, this is the side. And so kind of peeking in there, you can see here's this bit of cerebral cortex that's within this fold, within this really deep sulcus. So the insula receives a ton of sensory inputs, all kinds of things. And what it does is it translates this sensory information into subjective feelings. It's often referred as interoception, so a way of kind of taking all this information and making sense out of it. It's also important for recall of emotional stimuli, especially emotional stimulus that has a sensory component. So again, we've got memory playing a big role here in how we navigate emotion. And we know that the insula is also really important in disgust. So whether that be seeing something that looks disgusting or smells disgusting, they did fMRI studies, functional MRI studies, where they put people in the machine and put a mask on their face through which they could give them different scents. And when they gave them pleasant scents, the insula didn't really light up. But when they gave them something that smelled really bad, like decaying meat or really bad body odor, the insula would light up. Interestingly, it also lights up when you see things that socially are abhorrent to you. So violence, assault, those types of things will also trigger the insula to light up. So it's definitely a part of our disgust reaction. Finally, I want to talk about the anterior cingulate cortex. So when we're looking at the cerebrum here, we've talked about, should I use a different color? Maybe, let's try purple. We've talked about how much of the cerebral cortex, right, the gray matter is all on the outside here, and it's folded into the gyri and sulci. Well, we have this gyrus that's tucked in here, and it's called the cingulate gyrus, and it kind of wraps around the corpus callosum, and it's got gray matter in it, so it's got neuron cell bodies, and it kind of tucks down in there, similar to the insula, but different location, right? This is ribbons of gray matter, they're hidden kind of within the brain. And the anterior part of it, which is shown here in blue, the anterior part of the cingulate cortex or cingulate gyrus seems to be very important with managing cognitive control and our emotional responses, okay? So I'm having this emotion, right? This thing is happening. I'm getting the sensory input, visual, auditory, whatever. I'm having this emotional response, and now what do I do? What decisions do I make? Do I act out? Do I express the emotion? Do I blow off the handle? Do I just sit and simmer? This seems to be the job of the anterior cingulate cortex. So we often refer to this as emotional regulation, the ability to kind of not have your emotions go up and down and up and down as each little thing happens to you over the course of the day. And we know that this part of the brain is also really important for decision making, impulse control. So again, prefrontal cortex is important for that too, and also focus and attention, which is kind of interesting. So I want to say a little bit more about emotional regulation because we know that people often have difficulty with regulating their emotional state in some mood disorders such as depression and anxiety. And what they find is that the anterior cingulate cortex is not working as well. So some studies show it doesn't light up as brightly on a functional MRI. Other studies have shown that it has decreased brain volume. There isn't as much gray matter. It seems to have withered a bit. And we see that also in people with borderline personality disorder, which is a condition where people often have pretty strong emotional responses to events. So it kind of makes sense. So the image that is here is just they were looking at resilience, which is kind of maybe a flip side of emotional dysregulation. So the ability to withstand really difficult things and persevere through them. But I just like that they pointed out the emotional arousal network and the parts of the brain that light up when we have a strong emotion. So your hippocampus and your amygdala, right? We've talked about that. And then here they've got that anterior cingulate cortex, which is lighting up to help manage the response to that emotion. Okay. So emotional regulation is often considered as consisting of two different things. There are two things that you can do actively in a moment to help kind of weather the storm of your emotions. One is cognitive reappraisal. So this is kind of reframing the event or the stimulus or whatever it is as something that is not as negative as you kind of automatically associate it with. So here's this example of being stuck in traffic. You could be like, I'm frustrated, this is annoying, and now it's going to take me longer to get to work or wherever you're going. Or you could say, right, so an example of cognitive reappraisal is, well, I have more time to listen to my favorite podcast, right, or whatever it may be. So this is a pretty simple example, obviously, but my son is a master of this. If we're traveling and inevitably frustrations come your way, things get delayed, luggage gets lost, all those kinds of things, a restaurant isn't open when it's supposed to be. My son is kind of a master at this, so saying, well, that's okay. We'll be fine. Let's do this other thing instead, right? So kind of reframing things in your mind. This is the type of work that often happens in something called cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which we're also going to talk about more when we talk about mood disorders. The other part of emotional regulation or emotion regulation is expressive suppression, where you're inhibiting the outward expression of whatever the emotions might be. So this is when it's you're really angry, you're really upset, and you just take a deep breath, count to 10, right? This is kind of after the fact, you're already having this emotion, and you're just going to be stay calm, keep it together, keep it under control. So that's the expressive suppression part. Now, obviously, people say, well, you shouldn't suppress your emotions. The data actually suggests that for people who have trouble with emotional regulation and have lots of ups and downs, this actually is a beneficial thing to intentionally work to cultivate. The last thing that I want to leave you with is Papes' circuit. So Papes was a neuroscientist and one of the first people to kind of start to identify the different parts of the brain that are involved in emotion. So kind of the limbic system, as we've been talking about. I am not going to quiz you on the different directions the arrows are going. What I want you to understand is that all different regions of the brain are talking to each other. The amygdala was added later to this. The insula should probably be there too. There's there's a whole bunch of other nuclei in the brain that people have now characterized that are also part of this. But there's all types of communications happening between all these different regions of the brain. And so that's what I want you to be aware of. It's this whole network of things working together. And the output, like the end, is that you have like feelings. You have a physiologic response thanks to your hypothalamus, right? Your heart races, or your stomach feels like it's in knots, or your mouth goes dry. And then I would also put in here that then you also make choices, right? So you have outward expression of behavior, or outward expression of emotion. You have behavioral choices that you make about what you're going to do in response to an emotion or a certain stimulus. But anyway, so that's how that all comes together. So putting the limbic system together now, the prefrontal cortex uses our memories to help frame and interpret events and figure out what they mean for us. It also suppresses aggression and helps us make decisions about how to respond in any given situation. The pituitary gland is going to do a lot of work for the hypothalamus, but what we talked about in this part of the lecture is that it secretes oxytocin, the love hormone, which promotes bonding within your social group. We're going to talk about some other pituitary functions later in the lecture. The insula, that little on the side lobe that's tucked in there, translates our sensations, our sensory information, our inputs into feelings, and is that word interoception, so having that inner awareness of what's going on. And then finally, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is our emotional regulation system. So how do we actually respond to these emotions and feelings that are arising within us? How do we kind of control them or make decisions about what's going to be in our best interest about how to proceed from there? All right, that's 23C. One more to go.